And welcome back. The Maritimes and Atlantic Canada saw its share of wildfires burning this summer. Some of them, including the Long Lake wildfire in Annapolis County, burned deeper, hotter, and longer than any other wildfire we've seen around here. Scientists say it's not just climate change and the drought conditions that's causing this wildfire danger, but also the way our forests are managed. Let's bring in Dr. Anthony Taylor. He's an expert in forestry at the University of New Brunswick, who researches and studies how climate change and forest composition all impact the risk of forest fires. He joins us tonight from Fredericton. Thanks for being here, Anthony. How was your summer?
It was good, Jesse. I had a good summer, but as you can imagine, it was a busy summer as well, given all the conditions with weather and how it affected our forest here in the Maritimes.
No kidding. It's October now, but we had several major forest fires still burning out of control in Nova Scotia and one in New Brunswick. I think that fact may have shocked some people to learn this, but I'm wondering if this is kind of the new normal.
Yeah, well, I don't know if the new normal is the right word, but it's definitely we should expect more weather like this into the future. And that's largely a consequence of inaction on climate change over the past 20 or 30 years. Like the weather that we're seeing this year, that's behind a lot of the fire activity and the drought activity that we're witnessing and observing here in the Maritimes, is primarily related to climate change. And there's a certain amount of climate change now baked into the system, so we can expect a certain amount of warming over the next 20 or 30 years. And so we can also, with that, expect years with more weather like we experienced this past summer.
Right, incredible drought conditions, drier than we've seen for a long time. But I'm wondering from your research, what are some of the other biggest factors that are driving this increase in wildfire activity here in the Maritimes?
Well, when it comes to the wildfire situation in particular, like the single biggest factor driving whether or not we experience wildfire is the weather. And the weather is controlled by climate. So you need to have weather that's, warm and dry, and that's what's conducive to wildfire. The next biggest factor after that, of course, is ignition. And one thing to keep in mind with the Maritimes is that, like, more than 90% of our fires that do occur, including this year, are from human ignition, human starts. So, I like to say, in order to control this, obviously we want to try to reduce and stop climate change. But the next best thing after that is to be fire smart around the woods. You remember Smokey Bear, only you
Yeah,
could stop a forest fire. And that's never been truer than ever.
right. First, you mentioned climate change, the climate, the environment, the hotter, drier summers, versus, say, the way our forests are managed. How are they combining to make the current conditions that we see in our forests?
Well, just like as we were discussing, after like the weather, of course, being the most important factor, and then the next thing being ignition. The other thing that comes into play then is, yeah, the condition of the forest, the composition of the forest, and how we manage the forest. Those are things that also influence, the amount of wildfire or the intensity of wildfire. And so things like forest composition, they do matter. Forests that are dominated by more hardwoods, mixed wood type forests,
Hmm.
they're less flammable than dense conifer forest. So if you have a landscape dominated by more conifers, then when you're in a good fire year, then that's a landscape that's going to be
Right.
more vulnerable to wildfire.
We're seeing some images on our screen while you're chatting there, some of the forests and the coniferous trees that are there. You've warned in some of your research that replanting softwood species after clear cuts can make our forests more flammable or perhaps vulnerable to forest fire dangers. How has clear cutting practices increased the wildfire risk around here?
Well, the linkage between clear cutting and wildfire, I wouldn't say is as clear.
Hmm.
Where it comes into play would be that if you clear cut an area and you plant it with conifers, which is common practice here because that's what our industry relies on primarily is conifers, well then you're planting a forest that is more vulnerable to wildfire when you have weather conditions that are conducive to wildfire. So that is something to think about moving forward. I'm not suggesting that we stop planting conifers by any means because it's an important,
Hmm.
feedstock to our industry. But if you're a private woodlot owner and you have a woodlot that's a large continuous softwood area, you may
Right.
want to consider maybe breaking that up and to either planting some hardwoods in with that, or encouraging hardwoods, or strategically designing your woodlot so that you have conifer stands mixed with hardwood stands to act as
A
a
mix.
natural fire break.
Yeah. Let me jump into this question. We're quickly running out of time, unfortunately. But if you could change one thing about how, say, Nova Scotia or New Brunswick manages their forests, what do you think would make the biggest difference in reducing future wildfire risk?
Well, the biggest thing that would make the biggest difference is if we all took climate change more seriously and made a stronger attempt to reduce the amount of climate change that's happening. But on the management side of
Hmm.
things, I think that what we're going to need to do and think about more seriously as a society is, you know, um, things like when managing the forest, ensuring that there's, adequate diversity, that we have hardwood stands, that we have mixed wood stands, and strategically use those as fire breaks, in amongst our softwood stands.
I think it's safe to say that these fires are becoming more on the regular. In 2023, we saw the worst wildfire in Nova Scotia. This summer, we saw the longest burning event in our history. But it's also impacting a lot of people's lives. I think of the people that are having to move, the populations being spread out to evacuate, the air quality. But we also weren't allowed to go into the woods for 3 weeks here in Nova Scotia. This is really playing an impact and maybe ruining people's summers. I'm wondering, what can we learn from this? And is there a new approach we should be taking?
Well, I agree with what the province has done there in terms of the fire ban this summer. And actually, it goes back to an earlier point we were talking about how, next to the weather, the next most important thing affecting wildfires occurring is ignition. And like I was saying, most of the ignitions that occur are human caused.
Mm.
And so a lot of the fires that we're experiencing is because of
Human
human ignition.
carelessness? Yeah.
Well, yeah. So again, like being smart in the forest when you're planning and working in the forest. But if you're in times of extreme dryness and fire risk, then that's when those policies, though, they do come into play and they're
Right.
useful because it reduces the amount of exposure of the forest to human ignition
Yeah,
in that
well,
case.
I know it was pretty hard for a lot of people not to be able to go into the woods for 3 weeks' time, and hopefully we don't have to go back there. But unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there as well, Dr. Taylor. I want to thank you for joining us. This is a big topic, and it's on a lot of people's minds. So thanks for joining us today.
Yeah. Thanks for your interest and thanks for having me, Jesse.
Right on. That's forestry expert and researcher Anthony Taylor. We'll have to go to commercial break now, but there's much more news on the other side. Stick around.